Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about ego death. Ego death's become a new buzzword among so-called modern-day mystics, and it's sort of replaced this big word that I always heard people use years ago, which was enlightenment. Everyone was talking about enlightenment, and now everyone is talking about ego death. So in the Western yoga meditation community, there's also this obsession and also a misunderstanding about what happens to one's ego and the problem of ego for the aspiring mystic. Now, the Sanskrit word for ego is ahamkara. I doing literally means I doing or I sense. And it's the necessary sense of self and being a personal self. It's not egotism or self-aggrandizement, which is the way many Western spiritual practitioners think of as having an ego. So part of the interest in the topic of ego death, I think, stems from jargon from the psychonaut and psychedelia community who use ego death or ego dissolution as a way to describe their ecstatic, dissociative, and oceanic states that they may experience when on, kind of heroic doses of a psychedelic substance. So among meditators and contemplatives who have experienced ego death as a consequence of their practice, and I'm among them, it can be a very visceral realization of the nature of self or of consciousness and the difference between one's personality and habits and conditioning and conscious will or consciousness with a capital C. And even the question may come up about whether the self as a personality actually has a conscious will, which was something that I grappled with during my own experience. So it's not necessarily a pleasant experience, at least it wasn't for me, although it can be freeing once the experience is integrated. And I've met only a small handful of people who not necessarily had the same experience as I did, but had the same realization that I did. So as for my own experience, it came after many years of study in Vedantist and Buddhist circles. I also had training and studies in Tantra, Shaivism, and yoga, different forms of yoga, including Kundalini stuff. And there were Kundalini experiences within that whole cycle. This ego dissolution experience came after a 2-year stint with a local Tibetan Buddhist Sangha where I was sort of being mentored to become a Lama, and I decided that this whole system was not for me, and I went back full force into my Vedanta studies for a while. In any case, I was doing a lot of meditation on my own, and occasionally I would get an uncomfortable glimpse during meditation of what I would metaphorically call an abyss. It was a dark, vacuous, foreboding space in my mind's eye that was kind of like I can only call it like a beneath place. It was like going down somewhere, something in the depths. And what it was in something in the depths of my subconscious. I was basically staring into the pit of the lower parts that were the subconscious undersurface of consciousness, the subconscious. So then one day, it all came flooding up, kind of like a nasty sewer break. And it came up because I decided to sit with it, as they say. I sat with that abyss feeling instead of retracting from it during a meditation sit. And what happened was a flood of emotionally charged early memories came up, and those interactions all burst into conscious awareness. Stuff from early childhood, all kinds of hapless and helpless developmental kinds of issues came up, and early interactions, and how it conditioned me going forward and orchestrated my life. And I especially saw how the emotional suffering and anxiety I felt and the circumstances surrounding them and boundary issues from that sprung up from a very early age were wholly unnecessary and meaningless, and that I basically suffered and felt awkward about myself, and that the whole shebang that many of us go through was all unnecessary. It was unnecessary suffering. And this filled me with anger because I had suffered. And because I felt shitty about myself for then what was 45 years that had gone by before I had this experience. And the suffering was for no reason except that I was locked in a cycle with everyone else in the same clueless, hapless predicament. So there was no one to blame. I couldn't blame my parents or, whatever, because they were in the same predicament. They were products of the same predicament. So it was this vicious cycle from the beginning of time of victimizing each other from conditioning, suffering, and ignorance. And I saw how this was all interdependently arising. It wasn't just one thing, and I was not just one thing. And I wasn't even a thing. I was just a happening. I was and we all are, the result of this kind of action and reaction of shit happening. So, most heart-wrenching, I think, was the realization that I was just a big bundle of habits and conditioning. I was momentum. I was momentum. I wasn't a thing. I was a happening. That was always changing. And my flaws and my momentum and the things I felt crappy about myself about were not necessarily my fault or anyone's fault. As I said, it was just action and reaction, hapless action and reaction. They were the form and momentum of interdependently arising circumstance. So I sat there for a while with the word automaton on repeat in my head. Well, automaton means a robot, something that is on a program. And I realized that what we think of as a person is a personality. And a personality is the face or mask of this robot, this automaton. It's just an expression of habits and conditioning. And in that I understood impermanence and no thing. And I had to ask myself what and whether a person, the self with a capital S, was something or the real around which this drama effervesced. Now, in studying Vedantist and Shaivite and Buddhist philosophies, we read and latch onto a lot of terms and ideas such as consciousness, ego, ignorance, suffering, interdependent rising, karma, habits and conditioning, blah, 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 impermanence, no thing, no self. Words just roll off the tongue in lectures and heady conversations. And I was a master at that at one point. I was just a complete, insufferable know-it-all when it came to chatting about this stuff. So, but what happens when you feel these things, these ideas, in a visceral way, in a crushing aha experience? That was a defining moment for me. It was an existential crisis, and I refer to it as my own ego death experience. And that occurred 25 years ago. So I was shaken up for a few days, and then something very interesting and graceful happened. I calmed the fuck down. I calmed the F down about everything. I felt a new wealth of compassion for myself, for my family, for others, for, people that I had interactions with, for better or worse, throughout my life. But as time went on, it wasn't that I was, floating on a cloud now, or I had changed, but it wasn't as if everything was now, wonderful, whatever. Maybe I went through a couple of weeks of having a wow experience of freedom, but, after a while, I just kind of went back to being myself. I continued to struggle and muddle through sticky circumstances from time to time, but I maintained an understanding of what it was all about, and I could return to it despite knowing that I was, a blip of semi-conscious karmic momentum 99% of the time. So it became, or my understanding of life and interactions became beautiful. I mean, perhaps beautiful in the Socratic or Platonic sense, where things were just as they are. And so everything was all right with them. Things were just as they are. So I could put trust in as the way life was, the way life and death were. Things became more acceptable, just so, as they say. And in that faith and in that trust, there was an allaying of existential fear. I just could trust in life, and I didn't need to have belief anymore. I didn't need belief, because things were just as they were. I didn't have to believe in something for it to be as it was, because it was just as it was, whether I believed it or not. So I could just let it be as it is. Now, my last stint with a spiritual group or meditation group was with a Soto Zen group. And I had been involved in a Soto Zen group for, I don't know, 4 to 6 years. I can't remember how long I was with the group before I moved out of the area. But my Buddhist teachers would say that everyone is enlightened, and everyone has moments of enlightenment. Enlightenment isn't this dramatic thing that pops out of you like, some psychedelic experience, or, it's just a moment of insight, a moment of clarity, a moment of here and now. And that moment can last a while, or it can be very fleeting. It could be a moment, or it could be a month. But it's just a moment of stepping out of the drama. And then because your body, because you're an ego, because you're in life, you just go back into it. It's okay to toggle in between insight, mindfulness, and just being a person. So after having an enlightenment experience or an ego death experience, you will likely not be egoless, because you have to have a sense of self, or ahamkara, I-doing, to function in life, to be life being lived. You may not even necessarily be non-egoic, because, as you may have noticed, dozens of people who claim to be enlightened and put out a come follow me shingle about it have been discovered to be notoriously egoic and worse. So you don't want to be like those people. You will simply, likely, just be a person who has had a moment of insight, and maybe many moments of insight. Your life and its ups and downs will likely just go on, but you may have a different underlying perspective and grace about it that engenders much more compassion for yourself and others, much more atonement or at-one-ment with life as it is lived.